Al Jazeera podcasts.
Today, correcting the record on Trump's South Africa misinformation.
They're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
Elon Musk, Donald Trump, and the persistent myth of persecuted white farmers in South Africa. I'm Kevin Hirten, and this is The Take.
My name is Lebohang. I am in Johannesburg. I am a feminist economist and academic. I teach, I research, and I write extensively. And you're catching me from Johannesburg. It's hot, it's sunny. It has its own challenges with load shedding, with Wi-Fi shedding, but it's where I call home for now.
So, Lebohang, I want to start with just a few statistics that might provide some useful context to this discussion. The first one is, in South Africa, around 70% of farmland is still owned by white South Africans, yet they make up just 7% of the population. Think about that. 70% of the land owned by 7% of the population. And the other statistic is that South Africa has the worst inequality in the entire world. So is there a direct connection between these two thoughts? Can you trace many of South Africa's current problems back to just who owns the land? Because that's such a big part of wealth generation, correct?
Absolutely. So, for example, how much cattle you have, how much livestock you have. It's also to do with autonomy, the ability to feed yourself and to sovereignty over your own movement, where now many people in agricultural spaces and in rural areas, African people, are viewed as trespassers.
First of all, when a white man comes and leases the farm, first of all, you must remove your cattle. All of them. He doesn't want the cattle. Nothing. All of them. So maybe it's the criteria they are using to remove all the black people on the farms.
And of course, this fiction that has also begun to take some currency of farm killings, and that these are predominantly white farmers being killed by African people, which is not true. And the statistics show again that there's a huge amount of danger of African people being killed in rural areas.
Yeah.
Being either mistaken for monkeys, being accused of stealing, and so on and so on.
So how did we get here? How, more than 30 years since the end of apartheid, do white South Africans still own this much of the country?
So we can place it certainly to the moment of settler colonialism, the moment of invasion, the moment of displacement. So that goes back to 1652. Jan van Riebeeck, who and his band of merry men and some women who arrived from different places, primarily the Netherlands, and then, of course, France, Germany, and a small smattering of British settlers as well. And, of course, what this meant is not only the displacement of people from their own land, but also the displacement of people from their own aspirations, from their own sense of personhood. So the only relationship for many years, for over 150 years, that the settlers had with African people, the indigenous majority, was one of laborer. So if we take it back to the first settlement, which was in what is now called Cape Town, it was a slave state. It was a slave province. People were being taken and enslaved in this slave colony. We were then also placed in these settlements, very similar to what happened to Native Americans and their reservations. It was really them trying to pretend that these little Bantustans, as they were called, were actually semi-autonomous, semi-independent states. They were not. And then, of course, again, the only relationship that we had then with our land, which we were displaced in, was working white people's land, working the land that had been stolen from us. That is really the sort of relationship that has continued to this day. Yeah. And then when you add to that, the very deliberate spatial planning, which of course has vested most of the really good stuff in the hands of this white settler minority. So including the best schools, the best agricultural land, the best homes as well. And how, of course, African people were then placed again into these small places called townships. And the only relationship between townships and the cities, which were formerly white spaces, white zones, was, of course, our capacity to travel there as workers, right, as laborers. So it's a really toxic, perverse, ongoing system of exclusion, of marginalization, of dehumanization, of depersonalization of African people. So no surprise, Kevin, that that, fast forward, 100 years, 150 years, that we now have these deep and embedded inequalities because it was designed that way.
So last December, South Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, signs this new law meant to help bridge the divide. It's called the South African Expropriation Act. What does this law actually do?
Well, it's really supposed to really enable the states to be able to take control of this many pieces of land that have not been used so many years, sometimes decades. It's supposed to firstly put in place a whole slate of public interest land use as well, which includes, for example, if land is needed for housing, if land is needed for a hospital, if land is needed for schooling, states should be able to appropriate that. But this is part of our, South Africa's commitment to land reform. It doesn't really talk much about expropriation without compensation. It's really talking about equity. It's really also trying to talk about land that's been abandoned. It's been talking about land whose market value has been so diminished over the last maybe decades that it hasn't been bought by anyone. And this is the sort of land that has become available. It's really not that radical. There's a whole series of legislations, Kevin and viewers and listeners, that have been in place since 1994 that speak to the rights of tenants, the rights of farm workers, security of tenure, for example, and said that 30% of land was supposed to be redistributed back to the African people by 1999. That hasn't happened. So what this piece of legislation is trying to do is to try to give some life, some impetus, and put some nuts and bolts into what has been theoretically agreed upon, but the implementation under the African National Congress, incredibly slow and sometimes very, very hesitant.
We'll have more with Lebohang after a break. Lebohang. This land reform law was signed back in December, but it wasn't thrust into the international spotlight until Donald Trump, a few weeks into his new term, came out against it. He railed against the law, signing an executive order freezing all aid to South Africa. Then he goes a step further, offering resettlement to Afrikaner refugees, saying the South African government has been allowing violent attacks on Afrikaner farmers. What is Trump talking about? Violent attacks on Afrikaner farmers. What does this have to do with this law you just described in great detail?
So his hypothesis, such as it is that this is racial discrimination. And unfortunately, this actually predates this particular term. This dates back to his first term. There's a sort of a small special interest group or Afrikaner interest group, which you probably are aware of now, Afrikora, who actually had secret meetings with the Trump on the first administration. And they've been creating this whole narrative globally of Afrikaner victimhood.
The South African government has passed a bill into law that threatens private property rights in South Africa that makes expropriation without compensation possible, and this is a serious threat, and we want international criticism directed at the South African government for this attack against private property rights.
And it really comes from a place of what I call white malice, and also complete white dishonesty. So it's this idea that they are this oppressed people. And, it's very similar to it's almost a very Zionist type of victimhood, one that suggests that they're the only oppressed people. It's very ahistorical. It's completely dishonest.
White South Africans make up about 8% of the population, but they hold about 3/4 of privately owned land in the country. In contrast, only 4% of privately held land is owned by Black South Africans, who make up nearly 80% of the country's 60 million residents.
It completely negates the way that African people have been displaced from this country, from our own country, and so on. So, as we know, the old adage that anything when privilege is challenged always feels like an inconvenience. It always feels like being victimized when you've had power for that amount of time.
Right. Yeah, Trump said terrible things are happening in South Africa. But this isn't coming out of nowhere. The right has been focused on this issue for a while.
Yeah.
The president of South Africa, Cyril Ramaphosa, has begun, and you may have seen this in the press, seizing land from his own citizens without compensation because they are the wrong skin color. That is literally the definition of racism. Racism is what our elites say they dislike most. Donald Trump is a racist, they say. But they paid no attention to this at all.
And of course, there's Elon Musk, who is of South African descent and is now a close advisor to Trump. He's accused the South African government of allowing a white genocide against white farmers. Elon Musk is not the only person with roots in South Africa who has the president's ear right now.
Yeah.
There's also Peter Thiel and David Sachs, who have been called the PayPal Mafia back in the day.
Yeah.
Thiel is a major Trump donor and Sachs is a leading fundraiser. What do you think we need to understand about their connections to South Africa and the role that they might be playing here?
Yeah. So there's like 1, 2, 3, there's like 4 of these former South Africans with all the grievance politics that they carry with them, who are clearly part of this kind of strange implication that South Africa suddenly has in the midst of the Trump administration. And then, of course, these are all people who, for the most part, have renounced their allegiances to South Africa. I think, to my knowledge, that Elon Musk still has citizenship here. I mean, Peter Thiel and David O. Sachs, for all intents and purposes, are now entirely Americanized in terms of having been completely radicalized into right-wing thinking, having a completely ahistorical and really delinking themselves from any of the problems that have arisen in South Africa as a result of their own deep complicity as well, or, whether historically, whether generationally, but their own deep complicity in both what is happening here in South Africa historically, and of course, what is happening with the rise of the right in the United States and across as well. Just on a final note, it's not surprising that all of them come from immense privilege as well, Kevin. That's not coincidental.
No.
So these are not people who are, on the ground, sweating their brows. These are all the recipients of the very same intergenerational unearned privilege that they now accuse an African-led government of trying to put in place for its own people.
Yeah. Part of Trump's executive order was to offer refugee status to white South African farmers, which is just quite a choice, considering everything this administration is doing to keep out and deport refugees from other countries. I mean, it's amazing. What kind of reaction have you seen from white South Africans to this offer? Does anyone want to come to America?
Yeah, maybe 5 people. I mean, people are comfortable, Kevin. I mean, there are very few white folk.
There's been some hilarious videos. Have you seen some of the videos of white South Africans? Yeah.
Dancing and having a great time. I mean, really.
At the pool, like talking about how they're a refugee now.
I'm moving to the USA, bro. Okay, why? Because I just got refugee status, son.
I then need to wash, so I have a dip in our pool, which is used for bathing and drinking as we have no running water. Then I sit down to apply for a job I'm not qualified for and cry when I don't get it.
Yeah.
Oh, it's so awful. And also, there's something to be said about this paper bag test of refugee status, which is really sinister. Yeah. Particularly at a time when you have, we are watching at a distance, of course, how things played out with at the border with Mexico, for example. How there's no willingness to host Palestinian refugees, Syrian refugees, for example, and let alone the way that Black and brown people who are not even refugees are being stripped of their personhood and of their citizenship. But we're gonna kind of fast forward and fast track a few ostensibly aggrieved Afrikaners. I mean, most people have no interest.
How much of the narrative that Musk and Trump are pushing, that white South Africans are being targeted and left to fend for themselves, how much do you think that's reflective of their worldview?
There's a lot of propaganda around Elon Musk and that he left here because he and his family were so opposed to apartheid.
You don't buy that one?
They left because this is a small, as it happens, this is quite a small town. There are people who know their family. I know people who know their family. I know people who went to school with them. They were always racists. So, I mean, they were certainly not conscientious objectors. Maybe they changed when they left. And I think this idea that African people are not allowed or permitted, especially in a country as I think quite self-aware and as strident as South Africa. We're strident in our sense of self-determination because we fought for it. There's something about the South African struggle that captured the imagination because of its tenacity and what was at stake. So certainly I think that this is the outflowing of a certain level of white malice, of white grievance, and unresolved white grievance, the kind of grievance that just doesn't want to understand that they never had a stake on this land in the first place, that it was occupied, that it was stolen, and that it was indeed never theirs for the taking or for the keeping.
What are the consequences of cutting off all aid to South Africa?
We're still trying to figure that out, Kevin, to be honest, because in fact, we're a very well-resourced country for the most part, despite some of the mismanagement and so forth. But, we are a fairly well-resourced country. I think symbolically, in terms of the actual nuts and bolts, we are aware that it might hamper some of our HIV/AIDS programs, for example. We're also aware that it might hamper a lot of work across NGOs. So you ask an interesting question, and there are different ways to respond to it. The one is that there's a problem anyway with donor relations, with the way that oftentimes it's incredibly imperial, incredibly colonial. It's very much about expanding one country's, the donor country's, political, economic, and even, other ideological footprints in ways that sometimes are really uncomfortable. But that said, the way that this has played itself out for South Africa is really ugly. It's really violent. And it does mean that quite a few smaller organizations and NGOs are going to potentially find themselves incredibly defunded in a very rapid space of time.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think we'll end on just with some raw politics. This is far from the only thing that Trump doesn't like about South Africa. In his executive order, he tied this aid freeze to South Africa's support of Palestine at the ICJ and also its relationship with Iran. South Africa also holds the rotating presidency of the G20, and it's a core member of the BRICS group. How is South Africa faring so far against this barrage from the Trump administration? Do you expect it to hold its ground?
I do expect us to hold our ground. It's what we do. I think, you raise an interesting point around this whole, the court of public opinion as well, which is in relation to the South Africa stand in solidarity with Palestine. I mean, there's no doubt that this is really an egregious act. Trump's behavior is an egregious act of vengefulness, of spitefulness, and it's certainly not principled. The other thing, I think the other part of this is that it also gives us the opportunity, Kevin, to rethink new forms of solidarity and internationalism and new forms of international relations from the bottom up, from the south up as well. Which I think, in every crisis, there's an opportunity to rethink and to reimagine things. And I also think that, by the way, most of us are aware that America is an empire that is in decline. And I think when empires, what bad luck having an emperor like Trump to preside over it. But I mean, we see these also as the kicks of a dying horse, of an angry horse. And one that we're not going to be intimidated by for the foreseeable future. I pray that our government is able to stand ground. I'm also hoping that, formations like the African Union, like the BRICS as well, we have powerful allies in there that will make it very difficult, I think, for the US to bully us in the way that perhaps they've been accustomed to bullying countries in previous generations.
All right. Well, Lebohang, I think we'll end it there. Thank you for coming on The Take.
Thank you so much.
And that's The Take. If you want to catch more episodes like this, make sure you're following our YouTube playlist here. That's where you'll find all of our recent content, which is updated regularly, so you'll never miss an episode. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so you stay in the loop with all things Al Jazeera English. We'll see you tomorrow.